There are things in this job that you take to your grave. I spent 12 years wearing a badge in rural Arkansas. I've seen fatal car wrecks on the interstate. I've seen domestic disputes turn violent. I've seen the worst of what humans can do to each other. I thought I had seen it all. But I was wrong. Most people think the scariest thing a cop can hear on the radio is "Officer down." But for me, the scariest thing isn't a voice on the radio. It's silence. It's the sound of a rainstorm on a tin roof while you're standing on a porch, knowing something is watching you from the dark. The official report says that what happened at the Henderson farm was a bear encounter. My Bodycam footage was flagged as corrupted and deleted from the server the next morning. The sheriff told me to forget it. He told me to let it go. But I can't, because I know bears don't stand on two legs, and bears don't laugh. The rain in Arkansas doesn't wash things clean. It just turns the world into mud. It was 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, the kind of graveyard shift that feels less like a job and more like a sentence. I was parked on a gravel turnout off Highway 7, listening to the relentless drumming of water against the roof of my Dodge Charger. The wipers were off, leaving the windshield a blurred, weeping mess of gray and black. I took a sip of my coffee. It was lukewarm and tasted like burnt plastic, bought 3 hours ago at a Shell station that smelled like diesel and desperation. I grimaced and set the styrofoam cup back in the holder. The only light in the cab came from the red glow of the instrument panel and the Toughbook laptop mounted on the center console, casting long, weird shadows across my uniform. I shifted in my seat, the leather creaking under the weight of my duty belt. My lower back was already throbbing, a dull, familiar ache that came with 12 years of sitting in a patrol car. I was just debating whether to close my eyes for 10 minutes or drive back to the station to file paperwork when the radio crackled to life. "For Alpha copy." I sighed, reached for the mic, and keyed it. The sound of the rain outside seemed to get louder the second I broke the silence. "Go ahead, dispatch." "For Alpha, we've got a 1070 reported at 409 Fire Road 9. The Henderson residence. Caller states she hears movement in the yard and someone trying the front door handle." I let my head fall back against the headrest, staring up at the fabric ceiling. Of course it was the Henderson place. "Copy that, dispatch," I said, keeping the annoyance out of my voice as best I could. "Is the caller Mrs. Henderson?" "Affirmative," the dispatcher replied, sounding just as tired as I felt. "She sounds pretty shaken up, Miller. Says it sounds heavy." 10-4, show me en route." I clipped the mic back onto the dash and rubbed my eyes. Martha Henderson was 82 years old, lived alone at the end of a dead dirt road, and had eyes that played tricks on her. She was what we called a frequent flyer. Over the last 6 months, I had been out to her farm 4 times. The first time, it was teenagers throwing rocks. It was hail. The second time, it was trespassers in the corn. It was a stray cow from the neighbor's pasture. The last time, she swore someone was watching her through the kitchen window. I spent an hour walking the perimeter with my flashlight, ruining a good pair of boots in the mud, only to find a raccoon digging in her trash cans. I put the cruiser in drive, the tires crunching over the wet gravel as I pulled back onto the asphalt. "Prowler," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. In a county this size, real prowlers were rare. Most folks out here owned dogs and shotguns, and criminals knew better than to creep around front porches at 2 in the morning. When we got prowler calls, it was almost always meth heads looking for copper wire in abandoned barns, or wild animals getting too bold. I flipped on the wipers, the blades slapping rhythmically against the glass. The headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the tunnel of oak trees that lined the county road. I wasn't scared. I wasn't even alert, really. I was just annoyed that I had to go get my boots muddy again. I figured I'd drive out there, shine my spotlight around the yard, scare off whatever coyote or possum was scratching at her siding, and reassure Mrs. Henderson that nobody was trying to break in. I'd tell her to lock the deadbolt, maybe make her a cup of tea if she was really worked up, and then get back to my lukewarm coffee. It was routine. It was the kind of call you handle with one hand on the wheel and your mind on what you're going to have for breakfast. I turned onto Fire Road 9. The pavement ended and the car bounced as the tires hit the rutted red clay. The trees closed in tighter here, their branches scraping the sides of the cruiser like skeleton fingers. If I had known what was waiting for me at the end of that driveway, I wouldn't have been thinking about breakfast. I would have turned the car around, radioed for SWAT, and prayed that the rain would hide me. But I didn't know. So I just drove on, pressing the gas pedal a little harder, rushing to meet the nightmare. Fire Road 9 wasn't really a road. It was a scar cut deep into the timber, barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. In the dry summer months, it was a dust bowl. Tonight, under the relentless assault of the storm, it was a river of red sludge. I fought the steering wheel as the heavy Charger slid through the mud, the rear tires spinning every time I touched the gas. The suspension groaned as I dipped into ruts that felt deep enough to swallow a boot. On either side of the track, the ancient oak trees leaned in close, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead to form a suffocating canopy. It felt less like driving down a driveway and more like driving down a throat. The rain hammered against the windshield, drowning out the engine's idle. I had to lean forward, squinting through the glass, my knuckles white on the wheel. It was a mile to the house, but in the dark and the mud, it felt like 10. Usually when I came out this way, I could see the glow of Mrs. Henderson's porch light from the halfway point, a little beacon of warmth in the middle of nowhere. But tonight, the woods were pitch black. There was no light, no golden square of a window, just the endless, driving rain and the sweep of my own headlights cutting through the fog. "Power's probably out," I muttered, trying to convince myself. It made sense. A storm like this could knock down a line anywhere in the county. The trees finally broke, and the farmhouse loomed up out of the darkness. It was a relic of a different time. 2 stories of white clapboard siding, a wraparound porch, and a tin roof that was currently roaring under the deluge. I pulled the cruiser into the gravel circle near the front steps and threw the transmission into park. I didn't get out immediately. Instead, I reached up to the overhead console and flipped the toggle for the takedowns. The super bright white spotlights mounted on the roof light bar. Clicking. Instantly, the yard was bathed in blinding, artificial daylight. The harsh white light cut through the rain, casting long, sharp shadows behind the rocking chairs and the flower pots. It bleached the color out of everything, turning the house into a ghostly, overexposed photograph. I scanned the porch, waiting for the routine to play out. Every other time I'd been here, Martha Henderson was waiting for me before I even put the car in park. She'd be standing right there by the railing, wrapped in that thick purple bathrobe of hers, clutching a flashlight, looking small and terrified but relieved to see the badge. She would wave. She would point toward the cornfield. She would talk a mile a minute before I even got my door open. But tonight the porch was empty. The rocking chairs sat still, soaked by the blowing rain. The flower pots were overturned, spilling dark soil across the gray-painted wood. "Mrs. Henderson," I said to the empty car, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. My eyes swept past the chairs and locked onto the front entrance. The heavy oak door, which Mrs. Henderson kept triple-locked with deadbolts strong enough to stop a battering ram, was standing wide open. It wasn't just cracked, it was gaping. It banged rhythmically against the interior wall, pushed by the wind, then swung back out, only to be slammed open again. Rain was blowing straight into the foyer. I could see the water glistening on the hardwood floor of the entryway. Mrs. Henderson was fastidious. She treated dirt like a moral failing. There was no way in hell she would leave her front door open in a storm like this. She wouldn't let the heat out, and she certainly wouldn't let the rain in. The annoyance I had felt back on the highway evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline. The fatigue in my back disappeared. My hand instinctively dropped from the steering wheel to the retention hood of my holster, thumbing the safety strap. "Dispatch, show me on scene," I said into the radio, my voice dropping an octave. "The residence is dark, front door is open, no sign of the homeowner." "Copy for Alpha, proceed with caution." I didn't reply. I just stared at that open black rectangle in the white siding. It looked like a missing tooth in a skull. It looked like an invitation to something I didn't want to attend. I took a breath, listening to the rain hammer the roof one last time, and opened the car door. I stepped out into the deluge, the rain instantly soaking my uniform shirt where the vest didn't cover it. I moved up the wooden steps of the porch, listening to the old boards groan under my weight. The air up here was different, heavier, smelling of wet wood and ozone. My hand went to my chest, finding the large button on the center of my Axon body camera. I pressed it twice. A sharp chirp-chirp signaled that the buffer was saved and recording had started. A tiny red light blinked on my chest, a digital witness to whatever I was about to walk into. "Dispatch, I'm making entry," I murmured into the shoulder mic. "Front door is unsecured." I unsnapped the retention hood of my holster and drew the SIG P320. The polymer grip felt cold and slick in the humidity. I didn't hold it like they do in the movies, up by my ear. I kept it in a low, ready position, close to my chest, my tactical light mounted on the rail slicing a bright, white cone into the gloom of the foyer. I crossed the threshold. The sound of the storm changed instantly. Outside, it was a roar. Inside, it was a muffled, oppressive drumming against the roof and walls. It felt like stepping into a submarine that was slowly sinking. "Sheriff's Department," I yelled. My voice sounded too loud in the confined space bouncing off the floral wallpaper. "Mrs. Henderson, it's Deputy Miller." Silence, not the good kind of silence where a house is just sleeping. This was the heavy, suffocating silence of a place that is holding its breath. I moved forward, sweeping the beam of my light left and right. The living room was to my left. It looked undisturbed. The antique doilies were still on the armchairs. The ceramic figurines of shepherdesses and cats were lined up perfectly on the mantel. The television was off. It was a museum of a life lived quietly. But the air felt wrong. It was cold, unnaturally so, like someone had left a freezer open. "Mrs. Henderson," I called again, moving deeper into the hallway. The floorboards creaked, not under my feet but somewhere else. Upstairs, the back of the house, I stopped, straining to listen over the sound of the rain. Nothing, just the house settling. I pushed past the staircase and headed toward the kitchen at the back of the house. That was the heart of Martha's world. If she was home, she was usually there. I swung the flashlight beam around the doorframe and froze. The living room had been pristine. The kitchen was a war zone. The heavy oak dining table, a solid piece of furniture that must have weighed 200 pounds, was overturned. It hadn't just been tipped. It looked like it had been thrown. It lay on its side against the far wall, two of its thick legs snapped cleanly off. Chairs were scattered like matchsticks. One was smashed to pieces, the wood splintered as if something massive had stepped on it. I swept the light across the linoleum floor. It was covered in a mix of broken ceramic and food. A dinner plate lay shattered near the refrigerator, the remains of meatloaf and mashed potatoes smeared across the white tiles. I stepped closer, the glass crunching under my boots. I lowered my weapon slightly, staring at the mess. This wasn't a prowler looking for jewelry. Burglars open drawers, they don't flip tables. And it wasn't a raccoon or a stray dog. An animal eats the food. It doesn't throw the furniture across the room. My heart hammered against my ribs. The adrenaline that had been a slow drip was now a flood. This was a struggle, a violent, chaotic fight. I looked at the back door, the one leading to the screen porch. It was still closed and locked, the deadbolt engaged. "Mrs. Henderson," I shouted, dropping the professional courtesy. "Martha." My flashlight beam caught something wet on the edge of the overturned table. I leaned in. It wasn't gravy. It was a smear of blood, bright crimson and fresh. Someone was hurt, and whoever or whatever had done this was likely still inside with us. I raised the cig back up, my grip tightening until my knuckles turned white. I turned my body back toward the dark hallway, toward the stairs that led up into the blackness of the second floor. "Sheriff's Department," I said again, but this time it wasn't a command. It was a warning. The hallway stretched out before me, a tunnel of shadow that my tactical light could barely penetrate. The air was thick with the smell of violence, that copper tang of blood mixed with the spilled food from the kitchen. I moved slowly, checking my corners, every muscle in my body pulled tight as a bowstring. I was halfway to the stairs when I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in a house, and certainly not in the home of an 82-year-old widow. It was a rhythmic, dry rasping, scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the master bedroom at the end of the ground floor hall. The door was closed, the dark wood scarred and dull in the beam of my light. I stopped breathing to listen. The scratching wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate. It sounded like something sharpening its claws against the floorboards. "Sheriff's Department," I bellowed again, my voice cracking slightly. "Come out with your hands up." The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, waiting silence. I crept forward, the SIG P320 held tight against my chest. I didn't reach for the doorknob. If there was someone in there, the person who had flipped a 200-pound table like a poker chip, I wasn't going to give them the advantage of seeing my hand turn the latch. I lined up on the frame, took a deep breath and kicked. I put all my weight behind my boot, hitting the wood just below the lock. The door flew open with a deafening crash, banging against the interior wall. I swung into the room, leading with the gun, sweeping the space in a chaotic arc of light. "Let me see your hands, hands." The room was empty. The bed was unmade, the quilt dragged halfway to the floor. The dresser drawers were pulled out, clothes scattered everywhere. But there was no intruder standing in the middle of the room. There was no meth head with a crowbar. I scanned the corners, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought the Bodycam would pick up the vibration. Then I heard a whimper. It was a high, thin sound, like a wounded animal. It was coming from the walk-in closet on the far side of the room. The door to the closet was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering out. I moved across the room, stepping over a pile of knitting yarn and broken picture frames. I didn't shout this time. The adrenaline was starting to curdle into a cold, sick dread. I reached the closet door and used the barrel of my pistol to push it open. The beam of my light cut into the small space, illuminating rows of floral dresses and heavy wool coats smelling of mothballs and lavender. "Mrs. Henderson." At the very back of the closet, wedged into the corner behind a rack of winter coats, was a pile of laundry. But then the pile moved. Martha Henderson was curled into a ball so tight she looked like a child. Her gray hair was wild, sticking up in tufts. She was wearing her purple bathrobe, but it was torn at the shoulder. She was shaking, violently, uncontrollably, like she was freezing to death, even though the house was humid. And in her right hand, clutched in a white-knuckle grip against her chest, was a 10-inch butcher knife. "Martha," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I lowered the gun, pointing the muzzle at the floor, but I didn't holster it. "It's me. It's Deputy Miller. You're okay." She didn't look at me. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point in the middle distance, staring at things I couldn't see. She was catatonic. The knife was shaking in her hand, the blade vibrating so fast it looked like a blur in the flashlight beam. "Martha, I need you to drop the knife," I said, taking a slow step forward. "Nobody is going to hurt you. I'm here." She didn't drop it. She gripped it tighter. She was hyperventilating, shallow gasps that sounded like tearing paper. I holstered my weapon. It was a risk, but if I pointed a gun at her, she might snap. I held my hands up, palms open, showing her I was safe. "Look at me, Martha, look at the badge." I moved closer slowly, until I was kneeling right in front of her. I could smell the fear on her, a sour, chemical sweat that cut through the lavender. I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers on the handle of the knife. Her skin was ice cold. "It's okay," I whispered. "He's gone. Whatever was here, he's gone." At the touch of my hand, she finally blinked. Her eyes snapped to mine, and for a second I saw a clarity in them that terrified me more than the wrecked kitchen. It wasn't the look of a senile old woman confused by shadows. It was the look of a witness. Her grip on the knife loosened. I slid it gently out of her fingers and set it on the floor behind me, out of reach. "That's it," I soothed, checking her quickly for blood. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you out of here." She grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingernails digging into my skin. She pulled me closer until her face was inches from mine. Her breath smelled of peppermint tea and terror. "It wasn't a man," she whispered. Her voice was a dry rattle, barely audible over the rain pounding on the roof. "It's okay, Martha," I said, trying to pull back, but she held on. "I saw it in the yard," she hissed, her eyes wide and wet. "It was eating the scraps from the compost, on all fours like a big stray." She started to shake harder, her teeth chattering. "But then I turned on the porch light," she whispered, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I turned on the light, deputy, and it stood up." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold draft in the house. "It stood up," she repeated, her voice trembling. "The dog stood up. The dog stood up." The words hung in the dead air of the closet, heavier than the wool coats pressing in on us. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I didn't want to picture it. In my line of work, you learn to compartmentalize. You take the crazy things people say when they're in shock, and you shove them into a little box labeled trauma, and you tape it shut. "Okay, Martha," I said, my voice steady, though my pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm against my collarbone. "We're not staying here. I'm going to take you to my cruiser. It's warm, it's locked, and I can call for an ambulance to check you out." She didn't argue. The fight had drained out of her the moment I took the knife. She felt frail in my grip, like a bird made of hollow bones and papery skin. I helped her stand, keeping one arm firmly around her shoulders and my other hand resting on the grip of my holstered cig. We moved back through the bedroom, stepping over the scattered debris of her life. I kept my eyes moving, scanning the dark corners, the open doorway, the shadows that seemed to stretch and contort in the beam of my tactical light. The house felt hostile now. The walls felt like they were leaning in. We navigated the hallway, passing the wrecked kitchen. I tried to steer her so she wouldn't look at the overturned table or the blood smear on the linoleum, but I saw her eyes flick toward it. She let out a small, strangled noise but kept moving. We reached the foyer. The front door was still standing wide open, just as I had found it. "Easy now," I whispered. "Watch your step." We stepped out onto the porch. And that was when the world changed. Between the time I entered the house and the time I brought Martha back out, the storm had simply stopped. The torrential rain that had been hammering the tin roof for hours had cut off as if someone had turned a valve. The sudden silence was violent. There was no wind, no thunder, just the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water falling from the eaves into the mud. The silence amplified everything. I could hear the wet rasp of Martha's breathing. I could hear the ticking of the cooling engine in my patrol car 20 yards away. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. I scanned the yard. My takedown lights were still blazing, casting two blinding cones of white illumination across the gravel and into the edge of the cornfield beyond. The contrast was jarring. Brilliant, artificial light cutting through the absolute darkness of the Arkansas night. Then the smell hit me. I stopped dead at the top of the stairs. Martha bumped into me, but I didn't move. It wasn't the smell of rain or wet earth anymore. It was a thick, cloying stench that coated the back of my throat. It smelled like wet musk, animal and rank, mixed with the sharp, electric tang of ozone. But underneath that there was something else. Something metallic and unmistakable. Copper. It smelled like a slaughterhouse floor that hadn't been washed down. I had smelled this once before, years ago, on a call out near the river bottoms where a pack of coyotes had gotten into a calf pen. But this was stronger. This was fresher. "Deputy," Martha whispered, clutching my sleeve. "Quiet," I breathed. I looked out past the cruiser. Beyond the gravel driveway, the cornfield began. The stalks were 7 feet high, a wall of green and brown rustling softly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a figure of speech. It was a primal physical reaction. My skin crawled. I've been a cop for 12 years. I know what it feels like when a suspect is watching you from a parked car. I know what it feels like to walk into a bar where everyone hates you. But this was different. This felt predatory. I stared at the cornfield, at the spaces between the stalks where the light from the cruiser didn't reach. The darkness there seemed solid. I felt a heavy, focused weight pressing against me from the tree line. Something was out there, and it wasn't hiding because it was afraid. It was hiding because it was waiting. "Keep moving," I said, my voice tight. "To the car now." I didn't run. You don't run with an 80-year-old woman, but I moved us with a forceful urgency. I guided her down the slick wooden steps, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Every step felt exposed. I felt like a target painted in white light. We reached the passenger side of the Charger. I yanked the back door open, the hinges groaning in the silence. "Get in, Martha. Lie down on the seat." "The dog," she whimpered, looking back toward the dark void of the corn. "Get in." I pushed her gently inside and slammed the door. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the valley. I was alone outside now. I stood there for a second, my hand on the cold, wet metal of the roof, looking over the top of the light bar. I stared into the cornfield, daring whatever was in there to move. Drip, drip, drip. Nothing moved. The corn stood still. The smell of copper and musk swirled around me, thick enough to taste. I turned my back on the field, the hardest thing I've ever had to do, and walked around to the driver's side. I threw myself into the seat and locked the doors instantly. Safe, or so I thought. In just a few seconds, Deputy Miller is going to look down at his dashcam monitor and see something that defies all logic. Something that was waiting for him right behind the trunk of his car. But before we reveal the footage that the sheriff tried to delete, if you want to brave the deep woods with us every week, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. It's the only way to ensure you don't miss the next encounter. Now, let's see what was on the screen. I slammed the driver's side door and hit the lock button immediately. The heavy thunk click of the mechanism engaging was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. For a second I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, breathing in the smell of stale coffee and old upholstery. The interior of a patrol car is a sanctuary. It's armor, it's steel and safety glass, and a radio that connects you to the rest of the civilized world. Inside the Charger, the oppressive atmosphere of the farm felt a little less heavy. The smell of copper and musk was replaced by the familiar scent of gun oil and cheap air freshener. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Martha was huddled in the back seat behind the wire mesh partition. She was small and gray, staring blankly at the floorboards, shivering. "You're all right, Martha," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "We're leaving now. I'll have you at the hospital in 20 minutes. She didn't answer. She didn't even look up. I put my hand on the gear shift, ready to throw the car into reverse and get the hell out of that gravel circle. My foot hovered over the brake. But habit is a powerful thing. Before I moved, I checked my surroundings. Left mirror clear, right mirror clear. Then I looked down at the Panasonic Toughbook mounted on the center console. The screen was glowing with the feeds from the car's camera system. The front dashcam showed the empty porch, bathed in the harsh white glare of my takedown lights. The back seat camera showed the top of Martha's head. And then there was the rear-facing exterior camera. It was mounted on the back deck, just inside the rear window, designed to record traffic stops or capture license plates of cars trailing too close. The image was grainy, black and white, and slightly distorted by the rain droplets on the glass. I froze. The screen should have shown the dark gravel driveway, and the edge of the cornfield illuminated by my taillights. It didn't. The bottom half of the screen was filled with something black. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Mud, I thought. I kicked up mud on the lens when I drove in. Or maybe a trash bag had blown against the trunk in the storm. Then the black mass shifted. It rippled. It wasn't mud. It was texture. It was coarse, wet fur, matted and thick, heaving with the slow rhythm of breathing. My heart stopped. I stared at the small digital screen, unable to blink, unable to breathe. The object was crouching right behind the trunk of the cruiser. It was so close that if I had reversed, I would have run right over it. "What the?" I whispered. As if it heard me, the shape moved. It didn't scamper away like a coyote. It didn't lumber off on all fours like a bear. It uncoiled. I watched in paralyzed horror on the glowing monitor as the creature stood up. It rose, and it kept rising. First, I saw the massive, heaving shoulders wide as a linebacker, but hunched with rugged muscle. Then came the chest, broad and tapered, covered in that dark, wet fur. It kept going up. The camera angle was fixed, looking straight back. The creature was so tall that its head went out of frame for a second. It was standing on two legs. The suspension of the charger creaked as the creature took a step closer, its massive shadow falling over the rear window. I looked up from the screen to the rear-view mirror, but all I could see was the reflection of the mesh cage and the darkness beyond the glass. I looked back down at the laptop. The creature took a step back, bringing its face into the camera's view. A scream died in my throat. It was a nightmare spliced together from the worst parts of the animal kingdom. It had the snout of a wolf, long and filled with jagged teeth that glistened in the red glow of my taillights. Its ears were high and pointed, twitching, but the eyes were wrong. They weren't reflecting light like an animal's. They were intelligent. They were staring right at the lens, right at me. It was towering over the light bar. It had to be 7 feet tall, easily. It stood there on its hind legs, its long, powerful arms hanging down at its sides, ending in hands that looked disturbingly human, except for the curved black claws that dripped with rain. It wasn't a prowler, it wasn't a bear. The dog stood up, Martha had said. She wasn't crazy. The creature tilted its head, studying the car. It looked curious. It reached out a hand, the movement slow and deliberate on the grainy screen, and I watched as a massive, clawed finger traced the line of the trunk lid. I felt the vibration through the chassis of the car, a gentle scrape, scrape, scrape against the metal. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. I was a deputy. I had a gun. I was in a 2-ton police interceptor. But looking at that thing on the screen, seeing the sheer size and power of it, I felt like a sardine in a tin can. The creature leaned in closer to the camera, its breath fogging the glass of the rear window. It opened its mouth, revealing a maw designed for shattering bone, and let out a puff of steam. Then its eyes locked onto the back of Martha's head through the glass. The curiosity vanished from its face, replaced by a snarl that exposed every tooth in its head. Its muscles bunched. It wasn't studying us anymore. It was preparing to breach. The primitive part of my brain screamed at me to lock the doors and hide in the footwell. But the cop part of my brain, the part drilled by 12 years of training and academy muscle memory, Knew that if that thing wanted inside this car, safety glass and a door lock weren't going to stop it. Martha was trapped in the back. If it breached the rear window, she was dead. I had to draw its focus. I had to become the bigger threat. I slammed my hand onto the center console, hitting the master switch for the overheads. Click! The world outside exploded into a chaotic, strobing nightmare of red and blue. I kicked the driver's door open and scrambled out into the mud, my boots slipping on the slick gravel. I caught my balance against the frame of the car, raising the SIG P320 in a two-handed grip. "Sheriff's Department, step away from the vehicle," I screamed, my voice raw and shredding my throat. The silence of the night was shattered, not by sound, but by light. The light bar on the roof was spinning frantically, casting manic shadows that danced and stretched across the wet grass. The oak trees seemed to lurch forward and pull back with every rotation of the strobes. Flash red. The creature was standing right where the monitor said it was, looming over the trunk of the Charger. In the harsh crimson glare, it looked like a demon rising from hell. Its fur was matted and black, slicked down by the rain, clinging to muscles that looked like coils of steel cable. It wasn't looking at Martha anymore. It was looking at me. Flash blue. The world turned cold and ghostly. The creature's silhouette was etched against the cornfield, a towering void of darkness. It didn't flinch at the lights. It didn't bolt like a deer or a bear. It stood there, motionless, soaking in the chaos. "Get down," I yelled, my finger taking up the slack on the trigger. "Get on the ground." Flash red. It moved. It didn't run away. It moved toward me. The strobe effect made it look like a stop-motion monster from an old film. In one flash, it was at the bumper. In the next, it was at the rear wheel well. It covered 10 feet in the blink of an eye, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that defied its massive size. Flash blue. I saw its face clearly for the first time, and the image burned itself into my retinas forever. It was a wolf, but it was wrong. The snout was long and tapered, filled with rows of jagged white teeth that dripped saliva, but the structure of the face was almost human in its expressiveness. It wasn't a blank animal stare. It was a sneer. The heavy brow ridge cast deep shadows over its eyes, but the strobe lights caught the reflection. They were yellow, sickly, jaundiced amber irises with pinprick pupils that were locked onto my throat. Flash red. It was closer now, barely 10 feet away, standing by the gas cap. It towered over the roof of the car. I'm 6'2", and I would have had to look up to stare it in the eye. The smell rolled over me in a suffocating wave, wet dog, rotting meat, and that sharp, metallic scent of copper. It was close enough that I could hear the wet rattle of air in its massive lungs. Most animals panic when you hit them with the lights. They scramble, they slip, they show fear. This thing showed nothing but contempt. It ignored the badge. It ignored the gun. It looked at the strobing red and blue lights reflecting off its wet fur not with confusion but with annoyance. It was an apex predator, and for the first time in my life, I realized that I wasn't the authority here. I was just meat wrapped in a uniform. Flash blue. It raised a hand. The limb was impossibly long, the forearm corded with muscle. The hand was tipped with black claws the size of steak knives. It reached out toward the A-pillar of the car, toward the spotlight as if it were swatting a fly. I realized then that it wasn't just investigating. It was hunting, and it was done playing with its food. Last warning, I screamed, my voice cracking, the gun shaking in my hands. The creature curled its lip, letting out a low, vibrating growl that I felt in the soles of my boots. It took one more step, closing the distance to striking range. Flash red. I squeezed the trigger. The growl that tore from its throat wasn't a warning anymore. It was an execution order. The creature launched itself forward. It didn't leap. It surged, a wall of black fur and muscle closing the distance with terrifying speed. It slammed a fist the size of a sledgehammer down onto the trunk of my cruiser. Wham! The sound was sickening, the screech of metal folding in on itself. The entire car lurched violently to the right, the suspension groaning under the impact. In the backseat, I heard Martha scream, a high, thin sound that was instantly drowned out by the chaos. The trunk lid, made of reinforced steel, crumpled like a soda can, trapping whatever gear was inside. My training took over. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just reacted. I had a clear sight picture. Center mass. The glowing white dot of my front sight hovered over the massive, heaving chest of the beast. I squeezed the trigger. Pop, pop, pop. The gunshots were deafening in the humid air. 3 sharp cracks that slapped against the eardrums. In the dark, the muzzle flashes were blinding, stark, yellow-white bursts of fire that momentarily washed out the red and blue strobes. I saw the impacts. I saw the fur ripple on the creature's chest. I saw the dark puffs of mist where the hollow point round slammed home. A man would have dropped. A deer would have dropped. Even a black bear, hit 3 times at point-blank range with duty ammunition, would have stumbled or turned to run. The creature didn't drop. It didn't run. It flinched. That was it. It jerked its shoulder back slightly, like it had been stung by a wasp. It looked down at its chest, where 3 dark wet spots were oozing onto the fur, and then it looked back up at me. The amber eyes narrowed. The sneer deepened. It wasn't hurt. It was offended. Impossible, I whispered, my ears ringing. The creature roared, a sound so loud it vibrated in the fillings of my teeth, and swung its arm. It was a backhand swipe, lazy and dismissive, but it moved with the speed of a whip crack. I threw myself backward, my boots sliding in the mud, my spine slamming against the B-pillar of the open car door. The wind of the blow hit my face, smelling of rot and wet dog. The claws missed my throat by inches. Instead of my neck, the creature connected with the driver's side spotlight mounted on the A-pillar. Screech! The metal bracket sheared off with a sound like a tortured animal. The spotlight, a heavy piece of chrome and glass, was ripped cleanly from the frame of the car. Wires sparked and snapped, showering the hood in a brief cascade of orange embers before the unit went flying into the darkness of the cornfield. The creature stepped closer, looming over me. The strobing lights painted it in flashes of red and blue terror. It was so close I could feel the heat radiating off its body, a furnace of rage burning in the rain. My gun was empty. I hadn't counted the shots, but the slide was locked back. I had emptied the magazine without even realizing it. No, I had fired 3, just 3. Why was the slide back? A jam? A malfunction? I looked down at the weapon in my shaking hand. It didn't matter. If 3 rounds to the chest didn't stop it, 30 wouldn't either. The creature raised its hand again, the black claws glinting in the strobe light. It wasn't swatting at the car this time. It was aiming for me. I was on the ground, scrambled in the mud, my back against the tire. I had nowhere to go. I looked up at the monster, at the saliva dripping from its jaws, and I knew, with absolute, freezing clarity, that I was going to die in Mrs. Henderson's driveway. The claw came down, not with a slash but with the weight of a falling tree. I threw myself sideways, scrambling through the mud like a crab, my fingers scrabbling for the running board of the charger. The creature's hand slammed into the earth exactly where my chest had been a split second before, burying itself wrist-deep in the gravel and red clay. I didn't look back. I didn't try to fire again. I dove headfirst into the open driver's side door, my boots kicking wildly at the wet asphalt as I hauled myself into the sanctuary of the cab. The creature roared, a sound of frustration that shook the window glass and grabbed the top of the door frame. Metal groaned and buckled under its grip. It was trying to peel the door off its hinges to get to me. I slammed my left foot onto the brake and jammed the gear shifter into reverse with my palm. The transmission clunked, engaging hard. I didn't check the mirrors. I mashed the accelerator to the floor. The Charger is a heavy car built for pursuit, but in the mud, it hesitated for a terrifying heartbeat. The rear tires spun, screaming against the wet gravel, flinging a rooster tail of sludge into the air. Then the tires caught. The car lurched backward with enough force to snap my head against the headrest. The open driver's door was ripped from the creature's grasp, swinging violently until the momentum slammed it shut. We were moving. I was doing 40 miles an hour in reverse, blindly navigating a twisting, tree-lined driveway in the pitch black. The steering wheel fought me, jerking left and right as the tires found ruts deep enough to shatter an axle. I could hear branches whipping against the side of the car, screeching like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Hang on, Martha," I screamed, though I doubt she could hear me over the roar of the engine and the blood pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until the tires hit the pavement of Fire Road 9. The sudden traction spun the front end around, sending us into a drifting 180-degree turn that nearly put us in the ditch on the other side. I slammed the shifter into drive and punched it. I didn't breathe until the speedometer hit 80, and the Henderson farm was a shrinking point of darkness in my rearview mirror. My hand found the radio mic. I was shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I could key it. 1033, officer needs assistance. Shots fired, I repeat, shots fired at the Henderson residence. Copy 4 Alpha, dispatch replied, her voice instantly sharp and alert. State your status. Is the suspect in custody? Suspect is gone, I stammered, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that towering black shape loping after the car. I have the homeowner. We are evacuating to the main highway. I pulled over 3 miles down the road, under the amber glow of a lonely street lamp near the county line. I sat there in the rain, clutching the steering wheel, listening to Martha weeping softly in the back seat. 10 minutes later, the night was torn apart by sirens. They came in a swarm, 4 deputies, the state police, and finally, the sheriff's black Tahoe. Blue lights washed over the cornfields, turning the quiet country road into a disco of authority. Sheriff Caldwell was the first one at my window. He was a big man, built like a vending machine, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain too long. He shone his flashlight in my eyes, checking my pupils, then moved the beam down to my chest, checking for blood. You hit Miller. No, sir, I'm okay. What about the old lady? Shock, but she's physically fine. He nodded, clicking his light off. Stay here, we're going to clear the house. I sat there for an hour while they swept the farm. I watched the convoy of lights head back up that muddy driveway, dreading what they would find. Or worse, what they wouldn't. When they finally came back, the rain had stopped. The sheriff pulled his Tahoe alongside my battered Charger and rolled down his window. He motioned for me to get out. I stepped onto the wet asphalt. My legs felt like rubber. Caldwell walked around to the back of my car. He shined his light on the trunk. The steel lid was caved in, a crater deep enough to hold a bowling ball. The metal was torn in 3 parallel jagged lines where the claws had raked across it. He moved the light to the A-pillar, where the spotlight had been ripped off. The wires were dangling like exposed nerves. He stared at the damage for a long time. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. Hell of a thing, he grunted. Sheriff, it wasn't a man, I said, the words spilling out of me. It was. It was huge, 7 feet tall, covered in fur. It took 3 rounds to the chest and didn't even slow down. Caldwell looked at me. His eyes were hard, unreadable. You got video? Yes, sir. Bodycam and the rear dashcam. Show me. I leaned into the cruiser and pulled up the file on the laptop. I scrubbed the timeline back to the moment the creature stood up behind the trunk. I pressed play. On the small screen, the nightmare played out again in grainy black and white. The shape rising, the wolf-like snout, the intelligence in the eyes. Then the switch to the bodycam view, the strobing lights, the monster charging, the muzzle flashes, the impossible speed of the swipe that took out the spotlight. The sheriff watched it all. He watched it twice. He didn't gasp. He didn't curse. He just stood there, the blue light from the screen illuminating the deep lines in his face. Finally, he reached into the car. His thick finger hovered over the keyboard. "Sheriff," I asked. He pressed a key. "Delete." The screen flashed a prompt, "Confirm deletion." He hit enter. The file vanished. The screen returned to the live feed of the empty road. My stomach dropped. "Sheriff, what are you doing? That's evidence." Caldwell straightened up and turned to face me. He put a heavy hand on my shoulder. His grip was tight, almost painful. "Evidence of what, Miller? A werewolf?" "It's the truth," I whispered. "The truth is, Martha Henderson is a senile old woman who lives alone," Caldwell said, his voice low and even. "The truth is, a black bear got into her trash, got spooked, and charged your vehicle. You panicked. You fired your weapon. The bear ran off." "A bear doesn't have hands, Sheriff. A bear doesn't stand 7 feet tall and laugh at hollow points." Caldwell leaned in close. I could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Miller, listen to me. If you file that report, if you submit that video, you're done. They'll say you were hallucinating, they'll pull your badge, they'll put you on a psych hold. And that video, it'll disappear anyway. Only difference is you'll go down with it." He gestured to the dark woods around us. "There are things out here that don't fit in the paperwork, son. We don't chase monsters, we keep the peace. You want to keep the peace. You write it up as a bear." He patted my shoulder, then turned and walked back to his truck. "Get that trunk fixed," he called back over his shoulder, "and get some sleep." I stood there on the side of the road, the silence of the Arkansas night pressing in on me. I looked at the dark cornfields, wondering if it was still out there, watching. I got back in the car. I opened a new report file. Under incident type I typed, "Wildlife encounter." Under description I typed, "Black bear." I closed the laptop, but I knew as I drove away that I would never sleep with the lights off again.